So what he described was he saw a figure crossing the road from over in this direction.
They both agreed that something happened. Neither was sure it was Bigfoot. The second primary witness had said, they didn't believe it was Bigfoot. They thought maybe some kind of feral human, and then they kind of described a hairy man-like creature.
The Ossipee Triangle checks all the boxes. There are Hairy Hominid sightings, mystery light sightings, so-called bottomless ponds, USOs, mysterious disappearances. And then at the summit of the highest peak of the Ossipee Range is Sacrificial stone table. And this is the one that Aleister Crowley, famous magician, visited during World War I. That's the rumor.
When it comes to the realm of urban legend and the paranormal, nowadays the idea of areas of high strangeness is nothing new. Many of these places fall under the geographic label of a triangle. If you think about it, it's a neat and convenient packaging that is easy to wrap the mind around, even if the phenomena doesn't necessarily occur within the borders of a triangle. The most famous example is none other than that of the Bermuda Triangle in the Caribbean, with the Bridgewater Triangle of southeastern Massachusetts falling into a close second place. Also in New England lies the Bennington Triangle of southern Vermont, which is something I will be covering in a future episode of this series. But for now, let's talk about one of the least known triangles out there, which so also happens to be in New England. The Ossipee Triangle is more of a loose term to describe the Ossipee Mountains of central New Hampshire, which are a small mountain range located south of the White Mountains. The Ossipee Mountains happen to be in a nearly perfect circular formation, due to being remnants of an ancient stratovolcano formation.
So the Ossipee Triangle is a long line of triangles. Everybody's familiar with the Bermuda Triangle. I actually I lived all over the country, but I was born in Fall River, Massachusetts, which is, I think, one of the, points of the Bridgewater Triangle. Another very famous triangle, probably, as you have mentioned, the second famous triangle. The Ossipee Triangle checks all the boxes. There are Hairy Hominid sightings, mystery light sightings, so-called bottomless ponds, USOs, so underwater unidentified objects, mysterious disappearances. And then at the summit of the highest peak of the Ossipee Range is Sacrificial stone table. And this is the one that Aleister Crowley, famous magician, visited during World War I. That's the rumor. The Ossipee Triangle, funny enough, when we began researching it, so we had a road trip series, and we try to get out every year to hit a bunch of spots. We'd basically, a buddy of mine, my best friend from high school, we'd hit as many spots as we could in the Southwest or wherever we might go. We decided to investigate this story that Aleister Crowley had visited a spot in New Hampshire, in 2014. Had no idea it was a triangle, had no idea that there was this whole umbra of high strangeness surrounding the area. It was only as we begin to connect the dots that we realized that there was a triangle there. And funny enough, it was my first meeting with Lauren Coleman, who reached out to us to basically, point us in the right direction and say, this is a giant window area in the middle of New Hampshire, And a previous researcher by the name of Ken Moak had dubbed it the Ossipee Triangle.
Lauren Coleman, being notable in the world of cryptozoology and as the head of the International Cryptozoology Museum in Portland, Maine, had previously coined the term Bridgewater Triangle in the 1970s and had done research into various triangle or window areas in works such as his Mysterious America book and elsewhere. As for Ken Moak, there is very little out there online about his work regarding the Ossipee Triangle, and I was not able to find a copy of his article from the Journal of the International Fortean Organization from 1987.
There are a few ways of looking at the Ossipee Triangle. Ken Moak has a diagram in this issue of Info Journal, which is the International Fortean Society Journal. And I think the points are Mount Chikura, Wolfboro, possibly Meredith. That was, I believe, what Ken Moak sort of diagrammed out. It basically surround the Ossipee Ring Dike area, which forms, this perfect circle. Lake Winnipesaukee, I think, might fall into it a little bit. We sort of flipped it, inverted it, my buddy Kyle, who, and we charted it according to the Betty and Barney Hill encounter at Cannon Mountain. I would say sketchily somewhere around Ossipee Lake and then down to Mystery Hill. So very different, sort of our revisionist Ossipee Triangle, which really expands to fill most of the state. I would say the Ken Moak diagram is super interesting because there is so much, there are so many weird and unusual things within that Mount Chikura, Wolfboro, Meredith area. Meredith Mystery Stone. There was a giant skeleton that was buried in Melvin Village. The tumulus is out there. John Whittier Greenleaf wrote a poem to the giant that was buried there. These Hairy Hominid sightings, mystery lights. The list goes on and on. So you don't really have to expand it beyond that perimeter. But at the heart of Ken Moak's diagram, and really at the heart of our own revisionist diagram, is this sacrificial stone table on Mount Shaw. You find lots of references to devil caves and devil huts, things like that. And there was a giant mound structure nearby, now off Route 16. It's the Indian Mound Golf Course. I think it's the 8th hole at the Indian Mound Golf Course. But at the time, it was a massive mound structure that John Moulton, local figure, notorious local figure, claims he pulled 8,000 skeletons from in the 18th century. It's a really bizarre site, and when you compare it to a site like the Bridgewater Triangle, one striking difference is that the Ossipee Triangle, the geology there is so unusual. The ring dike itself forms a perfect circle, and it's used by NASA for benchmarking purposes with, satellite. The ring dike was formed out of, a massive volcano over 10,000 feet high that collapsed on itself 120 million years ago. So you have these really bizarre geological formations. It's a slaw of like granite, basalt, quartz, massive quartz deposits. You find all of these things that, when you put them all together and the various stresses and everything else, it's not a stretch to think it would have some sort of effect on our perception of the area. For instance, there's been a lot of scientific work done on piezoelectricity, which is what happens when you stress quartz. And this might play a role in so-called earth lights or mystery lights, which rise from the ground and are a known phenomena now. There's also a possibility that some of this phenomena might interact with our temporal lobes and create sort of these feelings of a numinous reality. Given the geology of the area and given the preponderance of sightings and other phenomena, it's not a stretch to think that sort of our brains are interacting with the locality in a strange fashion. And not to discredit sightings, not to discredit some of these things, it's just something that we're not familiar with, and it's only recently that scientists have really given any credence to any of this stuff.
Of all the strange stories in the Ossipee Triangle, one that has always stuck out to me is one that I have known about for many years, and is possibly related to a Sasquatch encounter. So given New Hampshire is my home state, I've always had an affinity for local Bigfoot and Sasquatch stories, and since about 2015, 2016, I've chronicled quite a few Bigfoot encounters, whether I've physically talked to witnesses, taken reports over the phone, interviewed people, and I've collected about 50 or so reports in those years. I've got 74 total reports, but only about 48 of them I've verified, by talking to the person, kind of not verified in the sense that I've proved them they're real, that just following up on some basic details that it actually kind of did take place, or that I felt it was worthy chronicling. It's not just a prank or a joke kind of thing as far as I'm concerned. A lot of those throughout the various counties in New Hampshire. I've got Coos County, 11 reports, Hillsborough County, 9 reports. Coos County is the furthest north county. Hillsborough is the furthest south county. Just reports from across the state. New Hampshire is the second most forested state per amount of forest, next to neighboring Maine, which is number 1, so share a large border with Maine. But my point in talking about this is, I'm going to discuss a very interesting case that is probably one of the most fascinating, and it directly applies to the Ossipee mountain range, and it's one of the more fascinating stories out of the Ossipee Triangle, and it's going to be a big focus of this episode. Just to preface again, I've been looking into Bigfoot stories and Sasquatch stories here in the Granite State, New Hampshire, for almost 10 years now at this point, and of the ones I have, I've got quite a few, but this is definitely one of my most interesting and memorable ones, and I think it's an interesting story, and we'll get into the details now. So I'm going to share a few elements from the story, kind of in the way that I came about it and how I have proceeded in investigating it, if you will. So I had learned about this story from a local news source in New Hampshire, and I had actually reached out to the editor who provided me the information to contact one of the 2 people involved in the actual incident. I've called it the Bald Mountain Curiosity. That's the story I go with. It happened on Bald Mountain or thereabouts. I actually have a little conflicting info about that. But basically I was given the contact information for one of the primary witnesses who was there in the incident. This person has unfortunately since passed away. 1979, this gentleman and his girlfriend at the time, along with their dog, are going into the Ossipee Mountains near Bald Mountain to bushwhack, and also primarily they were to rock collect. This man was a avid mineral and rock enthusiast. They called them rock hounds. So he was really into exploring and collecting a lot of these geologically unique rocks, which, from what I understand, there are quite a few in the Ossipee Mountains, given their kind of unique geological history. So they're up there, entirely off trail. Like I said, they're bushwhacking out there, and they come across and this is where we'll get into, there's 2 versions of the story that I've now since learned, but they come across this sort of stone structure with stacked rocks and a hemlock branch kind of roof. They're puzzled by what they're looking at, and they see some sort of hairy, large creature sitting inside of this structure with kind of hair, gray dangling hair. It seems like they were looking at its back. It lets out this vocalization or noise of some kind, and that really freaks them out to the point where they basically decide to run off the mountain. About halfway down the mountain, they realize, well, we had a camera, but they didn't have the courage to go back up there, so the story goes. That's essentially the very brief version of the story. Now, how I got involved is I actually reached out again to this editor who gave me the contact info, and I then interviewed one of the two primary witnesses, which was the gentleman involved. And he told me, I interviewed him actually back in like 2016 or 2017, so it's been quite a few years at this point in 2025 since I interviewed him. As I mentioned, he has since passed away, unfortunately, fairly recently. But from what I recall from my interview with him, he didn't want to be filmed or have anything like that happen. He said, you know, feel free to take notes during this call, and you know that's about that. But he basically described, you know, this sort of strange creature, and I don't remember if he ever said the words Bigfoot or anything like that, but he said kind of strange creature. I remember actually he did say he didn't know if it was a Bigfoot or not. That's kind of one of the only times I remember him saying that. He said he didn't know what it was, but there wasn't a single day that went by that he didn't think about this thing that he saw. It really stuck, you know, in his mind. And in his version of the story, his girlfriend at the time, after this incident happened, went to the Wolfboro Library, which is not far from the Ossipee Mountains, and found supposedly a book that contained a story from the late 1800s of a gentleman who lived on Connor Pond, which is kind of at one side of the base of Bald Mountain and some of the Ossipee Mountains. This guy was living on this pond. The pond had frozen over, and a dog had actually come out and gotten stuck in the ice, and that supposedly a tall, hairy man came out of the woods and saved the dog and then went back into the woods. That's what he sort of alluded to. Now, I have since searched for that story. I haven't been able to find it. I even know somebody whose wife worked at the Wolfboro Library, and he was into the Bigfoot stuff. She could not find this story, so I don't know about that element. But back to my interview with one of the primary witnesses, I just remember him being pretty sincere about it. Again, he said he wasn't sure what it was that he saw. It was just something unusual. And I asked him, well, you know, what about the camera? He said, yeah, we had one, but we didn't go back up the mountain. We were just so freaked out by what we had seen. What he had mentioned was when the dog, well, what happened was that, you know, they're seeing this thing inside this structure, cave, whatever you want to call it, and the dog noticed it and started growling. He said after the dog started growling, that's when this thing let out some kind of vocalization, some kind of sound. And I asked him if he could replicate it, and he said no, he couldn't, but he said it kind of sent a wave of fear over him and the other witness that was with him. That's what sent them running back down the mountain. And then I asked him, well, did you ever go back up to that location, you know, to follow up after that happened? He said, well, it took me about a year to get back up there. And when I went, and he went alone, went to the exact same spot, did not find anything there at all. There was no evidence of this structure, whatever it was. According to him, that's what happened. And I didn't have any reason to doubt his side of the story. That's just the way he kind of told it. And, you know, I've sat on this story for quite a while. I've told it in other presentations or podcasts and things when people ask me about particularly interesting sightings from New Hampshire and from this part of the country. But there hasn't been a whole lot I've really looked into in this case until recently, you know, with doing this project about the Ossipee Triangle and the Ossipee Mountains more generally. I began to revisit this story. Now, these are a few quotes from an article written this is how I became aware of this story from about 2006. These are supposedly direct quotes from one of the primary witnesses, but I have since heard conflicting information, and I will get into that, I promise. But basically, what was kind of surmised in the article was it was midsummer 1979. We drove in the Gilman Valley Road, parked at the gate, and continued up the old road past the Tamworth/Ossipee town line, he said. Then we cut into the woods on the right and headed west up Bald Mountain. The ledgy Bald Mountain is taller than Mount Whittier and is located just south of it. From its open ledges, you can look directly below to Connor Pond, located in the center of the range. We bushwhacked in 2 miles up to the ledges on Bald. The area contains a lot of Conway granite, and we were looking for contact zones, edges where 2 of the types of rock meet. Along these zones, it is possible to dig for pockets of beryls or topaz crystals. As the trees opened up before them, and Connor Pond became visible below to their left, they saw a strange sight about 100 yards ahead on the ledges. It was a small structure, yet made of big stones stacked on each other. The roof was flat and made of thatched hemlock boughs. There was an opening like a rustic doorway. We saw a giant man-like creature inside, about 7 feet high, and back to us. It was totally covered with tangled gray hair about 3 inches long. In the same instant that this all became visible to them, the dog began growling intensely and the creature started to make loud sounds, indicating it was upset. I can't describe the noise. Anyway, we freaked out and all felt threatened. We hightailed it out of there immediately in the direction we had come. Only later, partway down the mountain, we did pause and ask ourselves, what did we see? They both had carried cameras, but the urgency to leave never thought to take a picture. Over the next few days, they told various acquaintances of their experiences, and the story kind of goes on. So basically very similar to what I was told by the primary witness. I remember, because again, I had read this article even years prior to actually interviewing him, and he had indicated, pretty much similar, very similar to what I mentioned here in this article that was written about this. And again, I distinctly remember him saying, there's not a day that goes by that I don't think about this. I don't know if it was Bigfoot. It was just very weird. Okay, now to continue where the plot thickens or the story gets more interesting. Very recently, I actually reached out to the second witness in the story. Now, I had not done this previously. Back when I first started investigating this, I was just kind of really getting into the Bigfoot stuff and doing some of these phone calls and talking to witnesses here in my local areas in New Hampshire. So, I talked to the one witness and I felt, oh, that was good enough. And again, I didn't really do much with the story. But again, recently I managed to reach out to this person. They got back to me. They told me their side of the story, which differed a little bit from the side of the story from the primary witness. So basically, based off of the phone call with this second witness, and I'm going to paraphrase, based off of recollection from that conversation, I took some notes and whatnot, so I'll reference some of that. But this person had told me, it's true that they were up there in the mountains, that they indicated, that the relationship had ended between the two people after this incident, not because of the incident, but after the incident. So it's not really something, this person really wanted to talk about, but they were kind enough to give me time of day and actually describe what had happened here and said, something absolutely happened. But they differed with some of the details told in both the article and by the primary witness. So make of that what you will. But basically, this person confirmed, yes, we were up there in the mountains, we were doing this, and we came across this thing. And I asked, well, what was it, like a structure, or what did you see? And they described it wasn't so much as a structure as more of almost like an opening of a cave or some kind of rocks, something like that. That's kind of what they had indicated. I'm just going to reference my notes here to talk about that. So this person seemed to say, there wasn't really a structure. They never felt like they saw a structure, but they felt this thing disappeared in some kind of cave or it was gone. I mean, they had said this was such a long time ago. Again, this sighting was in 1979. So this person said, this is something I do think about, but not that often. But they had specifically said they didn't know if it was Bigfoot. They didn't really believe it was Bigfoot. They thought, it was just some kind of large person, feral human, very hairy, covered in, again, that like gray kind of hair. They had mentioned that, through their line of work, in the medical world, that's all I'll say, is that they had seen a lot of hairy men that have hair all over their bodies, all the way up to their eyeballs at times, and that maybe a person living out in wilderness like that would be able to develop a lot more body hair than the average person, which I found kind of interesting. So yeah, this person indicated that this event happened, that they were there. They don't know what it was. They didn't believe it was Bigfoot. They kind of alluded more to a feral human kind of thing. They felt that the other witness was the one that brought the Bigfoot into the story, or maybe that was when the article was published. They weren't very happy about the article, I will say that. But yeah, they had said, they remember this thing ducking into a little cave-like area underneath some trees and maybe rocks. And, that they did indicate that, yes, the other witness had then gone back a year later and looked for this thing and wasn't able to find it. Maybe, wasn't able to find the structure or the rock entrance, whatever. Again, we have two different conflicting parts of the story now. We have one side saying it was a rock structure with a roof, and the other side saying it was more like cave, rock opening, rock overhang. There's not a lot of caves in this part of the Appalachian Mountains, so it's not like the limestone caves you might see down in West Virginia or Kentucky or any of those areas. We don't really have that. We have granite overhangs, that sort of stuff. But given the Ossipee Range and its interesting geological history, it's possible it has some different kind of caves, but again, nothing like you'd really see a very deep, large cave. So yeah, the person had said, this was many, many years ago. This is not a recent event. But they had again mentioned that this thing was covered in gray hair or fur. Covered in gray hair, the whole body. They never saw the face. And they guessed it was maybe about 100 yards away. That was their guess. And again, they alluded more to like a feral human kind of thing than specifically a Bigfoot. So you have these two versions of the same story. They confirmed. And then where some of the elements differ was this person had said, well, the other witness indicated that I had found an article in a book about some kind of weird story from the 1800s on Connor Pond. And they said that wasn't true as far as they were concerned. They don't remember going to the library and finding that article or that story. So that's a part of the element, or that's an element in the story that maybe doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because where did that come from? Was that the other party making that up? Was that the article making it up? But at the same time, I remember interviewing the other witness, the primary witness, and they had said this had happened, whereas the other primary witness is telling me that didn't happen. This is kind of what when you really get into this sort of stuff, you have two people witnessing the same incident, or there and present for the same incident, and having a different recollection. And again, we're dealing with 1979. I mean, this is by no means a recent event. Even almost 8-9 years ago when I interviewed the other witness, it still wasn't a recent event then. In 2016, 2017, whenever that was, it was still a very long time ago. So you can imagine there's going to be some discrepancies, but there did seem to be some disagreement there. And this second witness, again, this recent interview I had done, they did not seem very happy that the way the article was published. They felt it was a little bit misleading, and that whole Bigfoot angle. But again, what I find interesting as somebody into the kind of Sasquatch topic is that this person did kind of describe something that to me sounds like a Sasquatch. I mean, large, hairy creature with a lot of hair and kind of fur. Make of that what you will. But to get into it, so we're going to go back to the element about, because I'm paraphrasing here from my notes, something about the Wolfboro Library, the story about a dog being rescued, and this person said, that did not happen. That was a total fabrication. They said, well, he would call it Bigfoot. I remember him thinking that it could be Bigfoot, right? This person indicated they kind of put it out of their memory for a while, and it wasn't until later that one of their family members had read this article and then had brought that up to them, and that's what kind of made them upset about the publishing of the article. But yeah, I had a good conversation with them, and what my takeaway with that second witness, again the second primary witness who was there, was that their recollection was pretty sharp in general about the description of this thing, creature, feral person, whatever it is that we're calling it. They indicated it absolutely did happen. There were discrepancies with the other primary witnesses' retelling of that story then into the article. There were discrepancies and fabrications, but they said, something, we definitely saw something. Maybe it was some kind of a person who was just living up there in the mountains. And I'd asked about the sound, and this person wasn't too familiar, not too familiar, but this person wasn't too didn't remember very much about the sound, but they said, they absolutely were taken aback and kind of freaked out, and that's why they ended up leaving and heading back down the mountain. I mean, this is not something they really expected to see. So that's kind of the full story of my investigation into this case. Again, you have the two primary witnesses that I interviewed, even though it was quite a few years apart. There were discrepancies there between the two accounts, one side bringing more of a Bigfoot angle and the hut or the stone stacked structure, the other primary witness saying no, there was no stacked stone hut. It was more of a cave or rock-like area. So that's another element you have to kind of deal with. But they both agreed that something happened. Neither was sure it was Bigfoot. The second primary witness had said, they didn't believe it was Bigfoot. They thought maybe some kind of feral human, and then they kind of described a hairy man-like creature. So we have these two versions of the story, but in my opinion, something happened. Neither of them really wanted much to do with it, especially the secondary witness. They were actually kind of surprised I managed to find them. I was hoping I wasn't bothering them with this line of questioning, but they seemed open to at least, again, saying, you're welcome to paraphrase, and this is kind of set the record straight, I guess, or this is my side of that story. So something happened. They saw something. Are we ever going to know what it was? Probably not at this point. It's just one of those stories that's there, and it happened so long ago in 1979. I've done some hiking there in the Ossipees to try to find where this area would have been, but you're not going to find anything from that long ago, let alone if it's something that happened last year. You might not find anything, let alone from 1979. So that's the Bald Mountain Curiosity story, one of my favorite encounter stories, and over the years it's one I've gotten to tell a few times, like I said, on various podcasts or presentations, but now it's really cool having the secondary witnesses account as well, and seeing that there were some discrepancies and even outright lies, I guess, about the way the story was retold. But at the core of it, they both said, primary witness, this is something that happened. There's not a day that goes by that I don't think about this thing. I don't know what it was. And that's pretty much exactly what the second person told me. They don't know what it was, but it was unusual. They'll never forget about it, but it's not something they really dwell upon or put a whole lot of significance to, but it was kind of a weird incident. So, as with a lot of these stories, they are just bizarre, strange incidents that we have no conclusion to. I mean, could it have been just a weird feral person living out there that grew hair all over their bodies? Stranger things have happened, right? Could it be some kind of a Sasquatch-like creature? I mean, that area has a history of sightings. There are recent sightings. There have been sightings since that time period, including a recent one, which I'll chronicle later in the episode with a researcher friend of mine named Evan, who took that report of a very recent sighting. You've got an area called the Gorilla Trail. Not that far from there in the southern part of the Ossipee Mountains. I don't know why it's called the Gorilla Trail. I've not found a satisfactory explanation, but that's kind of the summation of the Bald Mountain Curiosity. So where I find myself currently is the shores of Connor Pond here in the central eastern part of the Ossipee Mountains. It's a beautiful, kind of more of a lake than a pond, but behind me you have Bale Mountain, which is the closest. You have Bald Mountain and Mount Whittier off in the distance. So Bald Mountain allegedly is where that encounter happened with the strange hut, strange creature, hairy gray thing. And this pond is allegedly where the gentleman in the 1800s resided and noticed when the pond was frozen over in the winter that a dog had gotten stuck in the ice, and a tall, hairy, man-like creature came out of the woods, rescued the dog, and disappeared back into the woods. Now, of course, there's some doubt now being raised upon that part of the story, but I'm simply here at the location just to see what it looks like, and it's clearly a beautiful, very remote area. Nice place to hang out here in the summer, not so much maybe in the winter. While the Bald Mountain Curiosity may have occurred so many years ago, there have been recent unusual encounters with hairy hominids near the Ossipee Mountains, such as one reported to my friend and investigator Evan, who took me to the location of this recent encounter.
Alright, so back in the last week of April of 2025, I received a report from an anonymous witness in regards to seeing a Sasquatch crossing the road. He was coming from this direction, heading from Vermont. It was around 10, 11 o'clock at night. Now, there's a couple pointers with this encounter that really struck me. The weather matched up with the actual weather that he described for that date and time. The speed, as you can see right there, you got 50 miles per hour. He stated that his cruise control was set at 55 miles per hour as he was coming around here. So what he described was he saw a figure crossing the road from over in this direction, and it almost stopped a little bit right here where I was just standing. Now he described the creature as having black hair.
Did you say that one more time?
Yeah, he described the creature as having black hair and traffic cone orange colored eyes. And he also described it as it was right in this general area around the height of the sign right here that splits Tuftonboro and Moultonboro. So I'm guessing right around here, that's probably looking about like a 8 to 9 foot range. So we're talking about pretty big boy. going off of that guess.
And he's heading this way, and what's up this way?
So right up here, you got the Ossipee Range. As you know, quite a bit of strangeness going on in that area. But
there's basically nothing back here.
Nothing.
It's just goes up the mountain.
Absolutely nothing. Rivers, mountain streams. Yeah, it's remote. No one's back there.
And you know what mountain is up here?
You got Mount Shaw that's over here, and right down the road, heading to our west, is the Castle in the Clouds. Yeah, so the individual said that the high beams on his truck were on. He got a pretty good look at it. He described the face to have almost like a muzzle type of shape to it. Not like a dog, but kind of like a primate where it kind of juts out a little bit more than you would have with a person.
And so when you told me about this, you'd said he was a little bit reluctant to report.
Yes, he was very reluctant to report it. He actually heard about me through his son-in-law, who made him get in contact with me, well, convinced him. This guy is very by the books. He works in I would say, government sort of job. So, I mean, they don't just let anybody in there, even though sometimes it seems like they do. So he's pretty credible.
Right.
Anything stick out with the eyes?
The traffic cone color reflection, that's really it. Nothing too much, nothing too out of the ordinary. Pretty run-of-the-mill road crossing.
But it's the most recent sighting from this area.
Yeah, it's the most recent sighting from this area. It literally happened as we're filming this, probably about 3 months ago, roughly.
Wow. So he was saying it was bigger than this sign here.
Well, standing right here, right in this area, because as you see, there's a trail that runs across over here. You got the abandoned, old cemetery on that side where Brian is right now. So, I mean, it makes sense. It's going 55 miles per hour. This thing is, I mean, as he said, it had like a swinging gait to it. If it's walking this way, what do you see over here? Specifically, right there, direct access to miles and miles of wilderness,
right?
Basically, no one's out there. No houses, no roads, just woods.
While there are most likely more of these mystery hominid encounters in the Ossipee Range, these aren't the only unknown creatures seen here. In 2018, while working on a documentary project titled Lions of the East about mystery big cat sightings in New England, I conducted an interview with a biologist who had found some interesting alleged mountain lion evidence near Larcombe Mountain in the Ossipees.
Rick Van de Poel is a wildlife biologist from New Hampshire. In 2001, while conducting an ecological survey in New Hampshire's Ossipee Mountain Range, he made an interesting discovery.
So I was walking down this path and I saw this track and I thought, wow, this is different. Something, and I've been tracking mammals in the woods professionally since the 1970s, so I knew it was different. So I took a look at this and I made a plaster cast. And I know it's kind of difficult to see, but the toes are quite visible, and just the spread of the width of the track itself and the way these toes are sort of oblong shaped suggested that it might have been a large cat. So I thought, okay, I'll just take that under advisement and think about it. Well, about a year later, and I was still on this project, less than 2 miles away, I was climbing up to the top of this peak called Larcombe Peak, and on the way up, I had somebody, contact me and said, there's been a couple of mountain lion sightings. And so I was on top of Larkham, and I was sitting there in the sun, enjoying this south-facing rocky ledge near the top of Mount Larkham, and I literally put my hand on a pile of scat, and I was like, oh, that's disgusting. And I smelled my hand, and it was as feline as I could ever imagine, but the scat was 10 inches long and about 1 inch and 1/8 in diameter to 1 1/4 inches in diameter. And I thought, there aren't very many animals that are making scat like that. I thought, okay, this is enough. Get out the plastic bag, make the collection, let's see if I can chase this down. Long story short, it ended up that I contacted a fellow in Michigan who was collecting scat from what he thought were mountain lions in the Upper Peninsula and sending a batch out to the Wyoming Fish and Game. And about, I'd say, a month and a half or 2 later, I called him and he said, guess what? They found no significant difference between the mountain lions that they were testing from North Dakota and the scat that I had submitted. To me, it was a slam dunk. I thought, okay, this is it. I was ready to sort of, tell the world, okay, we got mountain lions in New Hampshire. I did 2 things wrong. One, I didn't keep a collection of the sample myself. I sent the entire scat to Michigan and the entire scat sample went to Wyoming. So there was no evidence thereafter. And the second thing I did wrong was tell Fish and Game. And the only reason I say it was wrong is that had I, in hindsight, thought about it, I would have probably laid a trail of, crumbs, as it were, to suggest that this is a possibility. So what Fish and Game did was they actually called Dee Dee Hawk at the Wyoming Fish and Game Commission, had her write a letter to Fish and Game refuting the evidence. They could not verify the scat as being definitively mountain lion. So they went out of their way to sort of, deny the report. And I thought it was kind of interesting. I mean, I wasn't so surprised that they would do that. If there was a rumor that mountain lions were on the loose in New Hampshire, God knows everybody and their kid would be running inside and not going outside and, arming up and, it'd be a nightmare. So, but I thought it was unfortunate because I'm a scientist above all. And if the scientific proof is present, I believe that has value for the public. Wildlife is in the public trust. Not unlike water, we own the wildlife. Fish and Game doesn't own the wildlife. We manage the wildlife. And so in that context, I thought we should be letting the public make the decision on the basis of evidence as to whether or not we need to take any steps relative to whether mountain lions should be looked for or managed or an educational program started. And it shouldn't be Fish and Game's decision necessarily to, bury that kind of evidence, which I was forewarned they would likely do.
Could the Ossipee Range house mountain lions? Why would the state authorities want to conceal this? The cover-up angle of this story always fascinated me, as it is something that comes up time and time again regarding stories of mountain lions on the East Coast. Perhaps Rick's story simply speaks to the wild and unknown nature of the Ossipee Mountains, remaining mysterious to this day. Speaking of the mysterious, one of the most intriguing cases in the Ossipee Triangle takes us to its highest peak, Mount Shaw.
Mount Shaw is a mountain pass that has had many names, and the summit, at least, is a mountain pass. And the trail that runs through it, it's off an old carriage trail, but there's definitely these older trails, probably Native American trails, that you can see kind of running up and down the path. And there was a pass up there that was considered cursed by the local tribe. For those who don't know, Aleister Crowley was he was a British occultist. He had a vast reputation as a black magician. Whether or not that was true, he definitely entertained that notion. And there are lots of stories surrounding him. He climbed K2, which was true. And he also traveled the world, which a lot of people don't know. He was in Russia on the eve of the Bolshevik Revolution. He was in Mexico during that revolution, and he happened to be in America during World War I, which is something that a lot of folks don't know. He spent a lot of time in New York City. He loved America, loved New York City, and in the summer of 1916, he visited New Hampshire. He was living in the cabin of a famous astrologer at the time, Evangeline Adams, who had him ghostwriting a book for her on astrology, which actually became a very major work for Crowley, even though it was Evangeline Adams' name was on the book. He spent the summer there, and he did some of his most important work in Magick. In fact, he declared himself the god of his Thelema cult on the shores of Lake Pasquaney, which is Newfound Lake in Bristol, New Hampshire. And he had these visions there. Not a lot is known about what he was doing there or why he was there. You know, I mean, a figure like Crowley spending a summer in New Hampshire, there's got to be more to it than just ghostwriting a book. That's what most people would assume. So when I heard the story, I had first learned about this because there was a rumor that he had visited Mount Shaw, the sacrificial stone that existed on Mount Shaw at least until 1953, when there was a giant forest fire up there. So the story is that he visited Shaw in 1916 and performed a ritual, crucifying a toad or a frog. You know, when I learned about the story, I wanted to sort of separate fact from fiction, because in Crowley's case, it's almost impossible to separate the two. But when you do, you find some pretty interesting answers. You know, he's had so much influence and so much impact on culture and history. So as I started to pull it apart, I started to realize that it was a much bigger story than I had imagined. Because Crowley at the time was also working for British intelligence. And so, you know, he always had another reason for being anywhere in New England. What links him to the Ossipee Triangle and the Sacrificial Stone is sort of central to the documentary we're working on. Okay, so here we go.
In 2013, we were conducting our own investigation into this story. We were not by any stretch professional researchers. We were barely qualified road trippers, but we had read in several weirdo travel guides that Aleister Crowley had come to a Lake Pasquaney for the purpose of a great magical retirement. That Lake Pasquaney was sometimes taken to mean Lake Winnipesaukee, a popular resort area which sat at the base of the Ossipee Ring Dike, whose peak was Mount Shaw. Later, we would learn this was wrong. Lake Pasquaney and Lake Winnipesaukee were different lake regions. Nevertheless, there were rumors about Mount Shaw, mysterious lights at its summit, bottomless ponds around its base, a dark curse upon it, and above all, there existed a great stone slab used for human sacrifice. Hence speculation on Crowley's own potential interest. This slab is rumored to have been real. Locals were known to visit it until 1953, when a lightning strike had caused fire to erupt on the summit. Despite several expeditions for the purpose of locating it, the slab had not been seen since that fire. To find out for ourselves whether the slab ever existed, we had very little to go on. We started with the easy stuff. The sacrificial slab on Mount Shaw was said to be identical to a similar stone at Mystery Hill, currently known as America's Stonehenge in Salem, New Hampshire. In that early fall of 2013, we learned that a former manager of the site, when it was still known as Mystery Hill, was giving a lecture there on sacrificial slabs and H.P. Lovecraft.
It would appear that that rumor sort of evaporates once you sort of realize that when he mentions Lake Pasquaney in his diary, but that could have been conflated with Lake Winnipesaukee. So, okay, so Lake Pasquaney was actually Newfound Lake. So he was staying, I guess, roughly 20 or 30 miles from Lake Winnipesaukee. So there's that, and then there's, the fact that the stone on Shaw has not really been independently verified. Accounts go back as far as I believe 63. But then there are these eyewitness accounts that say, yes, there was this sacrificial stone on Shaw, which was identical to the Mystery Hill stone, which is a pretty large stone. And to have a stone like that on the summit of Shaw would be something to see. So the question I had is there any possibility that there could be any truth to this story? And what would prevent Crowley from visiting the Ossipee region when he was right? He wasn't very far away. And given the fact that he spent the whole summer, and he was a mountain climber. He had a reputation for seeking out, these summits. I know Shaw is the highest. It's not the highest point in New England, or New Hampshire, but it's the highest point in the Ossipee range. But the other interesting thing was that Thomas Plant had recently acquired Castle in the Clouds in 1914. And Castle in the Clouds was part of Mount Shaw, which had recently been renamed to Mount Shaw. It's part of this broader Mountain View Park, which attracted a lot of wealthy elite types from Boston and New York. And Crowley was always inserting himself in these circles because that's ultimately where he was making his the cheddar cheese. That was where he was bankrolling his other projects, was sort of grift and graft with these elites. So there was a blue blood colony in Ossipee, and just another reason he would have been interested in the area. Thomas Plant's Castle in the Clouds was pretty notorious at the time. So the question is why wouldn't he visit the area? And so is it possible? And the other half of the story is true as well, that he would have sought out the stone, and come to find out he did crucify a frog. It's in his diaries. It's likely that took place closer to Bristol. If it's true that he visited Ossipee, and if it's true that he visited a stone, why wouldn't something like that make it into his diaries? Well, probably because it was part of some sort of covert operation. We first started visiting Carroll County and Mount Shaw in 2014, it's a difficult trail. It's very steep. Coming at it from one side, it's striking. You see stuff in the woods that is that a stone ring? Is that a dolmen? Is that a ring of stones? Is that could that be construed as a tablet? There's so many things that could possibly look like a sacrificial stone table on your way up Shaw. We went up the wrong path. We barely made it the first time, actually. It definitely gave us some drive to get our act together and make it faster the next time. However, the stone, according to all of the accounts, is in the western facing side of the mountain, which actually would have been the side of the mountain that faces Castle in the Clouds in Moultonborough. So when you come up that side of the mountain, it's a lot easier. And there's a carriage trail at the top. So there was a bridle path. So they would lead horses up to this bridle path. You get up to the summit, and it's actually two summits. It's the Shaw Summit, Turtleback. And I might be misremembering, but there used to be a UFO watchtower at Turtleback. One of the peaks, Turtleneck, and Turtleback, Turtleneck. So the documentary is called Strange Magick. I would say it's been 10 years in the making, ever since we took our first road trip out to Mount Shaw. It's a project that my brother Ryan and my buddy Kyle have been working on. This, just following up nonsensical sort of stuff and putting together the pieces, and working with these fantastic researchers, former Mystery Hill manager Dave Goudsward, who's also a Lovecraft researcher, and Dr. Rick Spence, who's a former history chair at the University of Idaho. But the documentary is kind of putting together all this research, which really should be a book and not a documentary, but I don't know how to put together a book. I'm a filmmaker. I'd love to write a book about it, but it's a lot, and I'm hoping the people that do watch it are getting something from it. But we're the rest of it, we haven't told much of the story, yeah. I mean, I would say, do I think Crowley visited Mount Shaw? If I find a stone up there, if we find a stone, then that only begs the question: why wouldn't Crowley write about this in his diaries? And the way I'd put it is, well, there's another reason linked to his covert operation that would be a very good reason why he wouldn't mention.
What place do you think it has in this sort of the general, like the broader New England kind of high strangeness, or where do you think the Ossipee kind of story falls?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if the Bridgewater Triangle is the most well-known, obviously, the Bennington Triangle. I wouldn't rank, it's hard to rank high strangeness. It's sort of, if something has that quality to it, it's hard to qualify things beyond that. I do think if you approach it from this angle of sort of so-called mystical toponymy, it's interesting to me that the local tribes had built this mound structure, or this mound center near the Ossipee Range. I find that when I go to these mounds, which are really interesting sites, I always find it interesting that the geology of the area is also kind of unusual. For instance, Serpent Mountain is next to, I think, what is known as a crypto explosion, which might have been a meteor impact, but they don't know. It could have just been this underground caldera that formed somehow. Other stuff. Mount Rainier is really interesting stuff happening over there. Also, obviously a lot of activity. The Ossipee Mountains, I mean, it's very old. These are the ruins of a giant megavolcano. You have these weirdly rounded hills, dome-like hills, and everything else. Indigenous tribe was possibly emulating some of those structures. I don't, who knows? I will also mention possibly one aspect of the Ossipee Triangle that seems unique to me is this character John Moulton. So Moulton excavated the mound it's now off Route 16. So John Moulton was called a Yankee Faust. His reputation was that he was trucking he was trucking with the devil. There's a story about how he convinced the devil to fill his boots with gold, and then he somehow tricked the devil by taking the soles out of the boots. Also, his body had vanished from his grave later on, which is, I guess, a historical fact. Like he just had a lot of stuff going on. He was one of these unusual treasure seekers in New England, and they have these weird sort of alignments with the occult and satanic influences and things like that. He's the one who wrote this account about the mound in Ossipee. I think some of the locals at some point felt that a lot of the weirdness that surrounded this area was due to him. And he, the town of Moulton Borough is named after John Moulton for his service during the Revolutionary War. But I think really that Mount Shaw, Castle in the Clouds area, he's somehow inextricably linked with that activity up there. I don't think there's any reason to discredit this idea that these areas are doing something or drawing something. I don't know if it means that this stuff is real necessarily, but there's something to it that it bears looking into.
There are, of course, many other strange stories and interesting tales from within the confines of the Ossipee Triangle, at least more than I can cover in just one episode. An area like the Ossipee Triangle, while lesser known than some other paranormal triangle areas, seems to have plenty of legend and lore to offer to those curious. If you have had a strange experience or have seen something unusual in the area of the Ossipee Triangle, be sure to let us know, as I, for one, am always curious about stories from the Granite State.